Good evening and welcome to the British School. Our annual master's course in the topography and archaeology of the city of Rome has now reached its 6th week, and we've finally arrived in the period of late antiquity. And we couldn't have a better guide to late antique Rome than tonight's speaker, Meaghan McEvoy. Since she held the Rome Scholarship here at the BSR in 2008-9, Meaghan has won 2 extremely prestigious postdoctoral fellowships at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., and currently the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Her book, Child Emperor Rule in the Late Roman West, which reflected the topic of her DPhil at New College, Oxford, was published by OUP to resoundingly excellent reviews in 2013, and in July she returns to Australia, where she has just been appointed lecturer in Byzantine Studies at Macquarie University, a place with which we have excellent relations, and so we hope we'll be seeing more of Meaghan here in the future. Tonight we hear a preview of her current research project in a lecture entitled Pious Generals, Military Investment in Churches at Rome in the 5th Century AD. Would you please welcome Meaghan McEvoy.
Sorry, I just grabbed some water. Thank you very much, Robert, for that extremely kind introduction. It's always a delight to be back at the BSR. I had an amazing and exciting year as an award holder here, and it's a particular pleasure to be invited back to present some of my current research. So thank you for that opportunity. As I understand it, most of the lectures for the City of Rome course thus far have tended to be concerned with Republican or early Imperial Rome. But what I want to do now is jump forward a few hundred years to the Roman Empire in late antiquity. In the late 4th century, where my lecture begins, we have passed through the period of the 3rd century crisis and the foundation of the Tetrarchy by the Emperor Diocletian, as well as Constantine I's overthrow of that system. The imperial conversion to Christianity has taken place, and the demise of traditional Roman pagan religion is gaining pace. There is also now essentially an Eastern and a Western empire, the Eastern focused on the new imperial metropolis of Constantinople, founded in 324, and the Western still with Italy at its heart. And, along with this, there were frequently Eastern and Western emperors, theoretically united in purpose, but effectively ruling over different territories of the Roman Empire and creating new dynamics in imperial politics. Turning then to my topic for this evening. In her important 2007 article on the titular churches of late antique Rome, Julia Hillner pointed out that although much aristocratic investment in churches in Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries is often assumed, we have little actual evidence, literary or epigraphic, for this investment. Hillner highlighted that there are only 12 securely attested interventions during this era on the part of the Roman aristocracy in churches in the city. Yet of these 12 that Hillner identifies, in fact 3 of those attested were actually gifts made by Roman generals. Roman generals were, it is true, considered to be aristocrats, those who reached the highest rank of Magister Militum, as each of these particular donors did, also held the civilian status of the Illustris or Clarissimus. But they were not commonly born into traditional senatorial families, and indeed 2 out of 3 of the generals associated with these benefactions at Rome were of non-Roman Germanic birth. In some respects, of course, there is no reason to suppose that a Magister Militum making a gift to a church was motivated any differently to a civilian aristocrat. As Kim Bowes writes, giving for Roman elites was necessarily bound up with self and familial aggrandizement. And despite the question mark in the title of my paper, I do not by any means intend to discount the motivation of personal piety. But given the tumultuous politics of the 5th century West, the immense influence of military men in these politics, and the growing importance of Christianity as a legitimating authority in this era, It occurred to me that there were good reasons for considering these benefactions made by generals, amounting to 1/4 of the known aristocratic benefactions to Roman churches in this period, separately from senatorial benefactions. With their different ethnic and social backgrounds, their high office holding, and their proximity to the throne, highly public actions such as major benefactions to churches are likely to have been inextricably bound up in the political prominence of these military men at court, in a way that the activities of their civilian counterparts were not. In this paper, therefore, I will examine firstly each of these benefactions and the generals responsible for them, and briefly look at the political context in which they occur. I want then to consider how these ecclesiastical gifts compare not with other aristocratic gifts, but with imperial gifts to Roman churches in the 5th century, and the question of whether we might see these benefactions by generals as supporting imperial activity or as independent from it, or even competing with it. And overall, I want to investigate the question of what these benefactions may be able to tell us about the changing role of military men, about the balance of power between emperors and generals, and about Rome as an ideological and physical battleground for loyalties in the 5th century. Thank you. The first known case of a benefaction by a magister militum to a church in the West is by the general Stilicho and his wife Serena in 395. Now, this benefaction actually occurred at Milan, not Rome. But before we move on to the Roman benefactions, I want to highlight this important precedent, both because of its political context and because these gifts made to churches by military men do appear to follow the imperial court. In 395, the new regime of the 10-year-old Emperor Honorius was based at Milan, following the death of the Emperor Theodosius I there earlier the same year. Stilicho was a part Vandal general who had married Honorius's cousin Serena during the 380s, rising through the ranks of the army to become a magister militum under Theodosius. And upon Honorius's succession, Stilicho swiftly took on the role of the young emperor's chief advisor. Also resident in Milan, as well as the imperial court, was the by then famous Bishop Ambrose. Shortly after Honorius's accession in 395, Ambrose, whose record of unearthing unexpected martyr burials was already established, discovered the miraculously preserved body of the martyr Nazarius in a private garden in Milan, and had the body exhumed and reburied with great ceremony in the Basilica Apostolorum in the city, an episode retold by Ambrose's biographer Paulinus. At this time he raised and transferred the body of Saint Nazarius the martyr, which had been buried in a garden outside the city, to the Basilica of the Apostles, which is near the Roman gate. We saw, moreover, in the grave in which the body of the martyr lay, although when he suffered we cannot learn even to this day, the blood of the martyr as fresh as if it had been shed on that very day. His head also, which had been severed by the wicked, was so whole and uncorrupted with hair and beard that it seemed to us that it had been washed and placed in the grave at the very moment at which it was dug up. To honour the martyr's new burial place, the general Stilicho and his wife Serena provided a magnificent benefaction of Libyan marble to build a shrine, and an inscription records their dedication, which also offers prayers for the safe return of Stilicho, who was then absent on campaign against the Goths. No previous benefaction of a general to a Western church is known from our surviving source material. Some Eastern Roman examples do exist, however, which I will return to later. In a very real sense, Stilicho and Serena's benefaction can be seen as an extension of imperial activities. They were part of the imperial family, and their prayers for a safe return for the general from the wars were also prayers by extension for the safety of the regime he remained an integral part of. The timing of the benefaction, so early in the young emperor's reign, is also important. The Christian piety and devotion of the emperor was coming increasingly to the forefront of the catalogue of desirable imperial qualities, especially with such a young emperor, and this need for legitimation through pious activity extended to the ruler's inner circle too. Stilicho's benefaction provided an important precedent for the activities of generals in the century to follow. The next known benefaction by a magister militum to a church in the west did occur at Rome in the late 420s and was the gift of Flavius Constantius Felix and his wife Pedusia. Felix is a somewhat shadowy figure among 5th century generals. He was consul in 428, and one leaf of his consular diptych survives, which you see here, and his gift, which was the presentation of a mosaic to the Lateran Basilica, is recorded in an inscription which details that Felix, together with his wife Pedusia, paid for the mosaic from their own funds, thereby fulfilling their vow. Felix's titles are given in the inscription as Magister Utrusque Militiae Patricius et Consul Ordinarius, indicating that the gift was made between his consulship in 428 and his death in 430. Felix's background prior to his sudden appearance in 425 as the first magister militum of the new government of the Emperor Valentinian III is entirely unknown, though given his rank we must assume a distinguished previous career in military service. Felix's gift early in the reign of the new emperor may, like that of Stilicho, arguably be seen as an extension of imperial activity, as well as an assertion of his own position, since he had two rival generals both scheming, ultimately successfully, to remove Felix and take up the position of generalissimo themselves. We know from the Liber Pontificalis that the Lateran Basilica was the recipient of imperial gifts as well during this period. Apparently, at the request of Pope Sixtus III, the Emperor Valentinian made a gift of silver vessels to the basilica to replace those which had been stolen during the Visigothic sack of the city in 410. Felix and Pedusia's gift may even have occurred at the same time. The next case of a church benefaction at Rome by a general, however, is more complex. And this is the gift of the Magister Militum Flavius Ricimer, who dominated Western politics from 456 until his death in 472. Ricimer held the consulship in 459, and at some point between his consulship and his death, made a major benefaction to a church known today as St. Agata dei Goti, which was probably at the time dedicated to Christ and the Apostles. Ricimer's gift to the church, located above the Quirinal, was a mosaic and inscription destroyed in the 16th century when part of the church collapsed, but fortunately recorded in drawings made shortly beforehand. The mosaic apparently depicted Christ seated on a globe surrounded by the 12 apostles, and below was Ricimer's dedication, which translates as Flavius Ricimer, an illustrious gentleman, master of both services, patrician and exordinary consul, adorned this church according to his vow. According to Sidonius Apollinaris, Ricimer was half Suavian and half Gothic, of royal descent on both sides. He is also commonly assumed, due to his heritage, to have been an Arian Christian, therefore not of the same orthodox faith as the emperor or the Roman aristocracy, although his faith is not referred to by any source, and the nature of the inscription accompanying his church benefaction gives no hint of any non-Nicene affiliation. The Liber Pontificalis does inform us, however, that during the pontificate of Gregory I from 590 to 604, the Pope dedicated the Church of the Goths in the Subura in the name of St. Agatha the Martyr, i.e. rededicated it to Nicene Christianity, suggesting that at the time of Ricimer's benefaction, the church may well have served an Arian community, perhaps primarily made up of Gothic soldiers in the Roman army. Ricimer's benefaction may represent the most complex involvement of a Roman general in a church at Rome due to his political prominence and stormy relations with emperors, and this is a point I will return to shortly. And, unlike the benefactions of Ricimer's predecessors, Stilicho and Felix, Ricimer's gift did not take place against a backdrop of imperial ecclesiastical benefaction, and nor did the final 5th century example of a general's benefaction to a Roman church, that of Ricimer's colleague Valila. Valila, like Ricimer, served as Western Magister Militum, possibly succeeding to Ricimer's position after his death in 472. Somehow, in the course of his career, Valila had come into possession of considerable wealth, and among his Roman properties was the Basilica of Unius Bassus on the Esquiline Hill. Valila chose to convert the basilica into a church, which came to be known as Sant'Andrea Catabarbara, and was dedicated by Pope Simplicius, surviving until the 1930s. Among the decorations already existing in the basilica were a stunning cycle of marble panels depicting the celebration of the consular games of Unius Bassus in 331 AD, and this is the senior Unius Bassus, not his son of the famous Vatican sarcophagus, and displaying, among other scenes, a tiger attacking a calf, the consul himself surrounded by charioteers, and the rape of the young man Hylas by two nymphs. Peter Brown recently described the basilica as a magnificently profane building. In the conversion of the basilica into a church, rather than remove these decorations, despite their rather dubious suitability, Valila simply added his own decorative elements to the building, a mosaic depicting 6 apostles and Christ, and his own dedicatory inscription added to that of the earlier patron. The notice in the life of Simplicius in the Liber Pontificalis informs us only that Simplicius, who was pope from 468 to 483, dedicated the Basilica of St. Andrew the Apostle close to the Basilica of St. Mary, without naming the donor. However, the dedicatory inscription from the church informs us in no uncertain terms of Valila's involvement. According to this text, Valila's wish was to consecrate his estates to benefit you, Christ. To you, this testator has dedicated his resources. Pope Simplicius, by making the adjustments for heavenly rites, rendered these things truly in your service. The last time I spoke about this church, the audience was disappointed I didn't put up the panel of the rape of Hylas, so there you are. The benefaction thus appears as a collaborative effort between Valila and Pope Simplicius, possibly not carried out until after Valila's death. Valila is also known to have founded a church near modern Tivoli, an event recorded in a 12th century document but dating the foundation to the year 471. Although Valila is a Gothic name, the direct involvement of the Pope in his benefaction at Rome, as the inscription attests, argues in favour of his being a Nicene Christian rather than an Arian. Interestingly, Valila's name, or rather the Roman name he also went by, Flavius Theodobius, is also found on a seat at the Colosseum, the inscription probably dating to the period between 476 and 483 and the rule of Odovacar. If Valila's church conversion occurred only upon his death, it likely took place also during this period, and therefore after the disappearance of the Western Roman government as a political entity in 476. I mentioned at the start of the paper that few cases of certain aristocratic benefaction to Roman churches could be found in the 4th and 5th centuries. However, the same cannot be said of imperial benefactions. And I want to turn now to take a look at imperial presence in the city of Rome in the 5th century, imperial benefactions to churches here, and the ideological dimensions of such benefactions. In recent years, the seminal article of Andrew Gillette on the last Western emperors, published in Papers of the British School at Rome in 2001, has challenged the once traditional and widespread view that by the 5th century, or even the late 4th century, the city of Rome had become abandoned and neglected by the emperors. Despite the general absences and extremely occasional visits of Roman emperors to the city across the course of the 4th century, only 5 visits are firmly attested after 312, when the evidence for the 5th century is assembled, it becomes immediately apparent that Romans were seeing their emperors far more frequently, with at least 6 visits recorded for the Emperor Honorius from the year 400 onwards, and many more, including eventual long-term residency at Rome from 440 onwards by his successor Valentinian III. Following the death of Valentinian in 455, of the so-called shadow emperors who rapidly rose and fell during the 21 years until the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476, the majority maintained Rome as their principal residence, with the longest reigning of these emperors, Anthemius, spending the whole of his 5-year reign from 467 until 472 in the city. From the reign of the Emperor Honorius onwards, therefore, Western emperors began to visit and invest in the city of Rome once more, and a law issued by Valentinian III in Rome in 440 famously declared that our constant care for the city of Rome, which we justly venerate as the head of our empire, abides with us to such an extent that we make wise provision in all ways for her peace and abundance. Recent scholarship has emphasized that under Valentinian III, imperial gifts to Roman churches had reached a level unseen since the era of Constantine, and all the more remarkable development given the decline in imperial revenues over this period. I mentioned earlier Valentinian III's gifts to the Lateran around the same time as the General Felix's benefaction. To name but a few further instances, the emperor also made a gift of a golden image of Christ and the Apostles to St. Peter's Basilica. His mother, Galla Placidia, had joined with Pope Leo I in the rebuilding of the great Basilica of San Paolo fuori le Mura following a fire in the 440s, and the Empress Licinia Eudoxia had made substantial gifts to the church of San Pietro in Vincoli. Such gifts of decoration or building were important legitimizing activities for emperors and their families, and the first half of the 5th century had seen wholehearted imperial embracing of this activity. Yet this record of significant benefactions to churches in Rome seems to come to a sudden halt with the death of Valentinian III. For the years 455 to 476, I have been unable to find a single instance of attested imperial benefaction to a church in Rome. Indeed, not even during the Emperor Anthemius' 5-year reign from 467 to 472 is there any record of the emperor having made gifts to Roman churches, although the Chronicon Paschale informs us that while living in Constantinople in the years before his accession at Rome, Anthemius had founded a church there dedicated to St. Thomas. There is one possible exception to this apparent absence of imperial benefaction at Rome, however, the Church of Santo Stefano Rotondo. The body of the proto-martyr Stephen had been discovered in 415 outside Jerusalem, and the cult of Stephen had proved immensely popular in both the Eastern and Western empires in the 5th century. The building of Santo Stefano Rotondo was only one of several churches or chapels dedicated to Stephen around the middle of the 5th century, a rush of activity probably related to the arrival of the saint's relics in the city. No inscription records the identity of any founder or benefactor to Santo Stefano Rotondo. Indeed, our notice of its dedication appears in the same entry of the Liber Pontificalis as the dedication of Sant' Andrea Catabarbara, and similarly with no association with any individual given other than Pope Simplicius. It is simply stated that the Pope dedicated the Basilica of St. Stephen on the Caelian Hill in Rome. But the great size of the church, the luxurious materials used in its building, and the fact that it stands on former imperial land all argue for imperial sponsorship. And dendrochronology, conducted by Hugo Brandenburg, has established dates for the cutting of the church's roof timbers after the year 456, while 2 coins of the Emperor Libius Severus, who ruled from 461 to 465, were found during excavations. It seems likely the construction was planned during the reign of Valentinian III, but probably completed under a later emperor. With the likely exception of the building of Santo Stefano, however, imperial church benefactions in Rome post-455 seem to have been entirely lacking. Yet we know that the various crises of the period left churches in need of such gifts. For example, we hear that during the pontificate of Pope Leo I from 440 to 461, following the Vandal sack of the city in 455, the bishop personally replaced all the consecrated silver services throughout all the tituli by melting down 6 water jars, 2 at the Constantinian Basilica, 2 at the Basilica of St. Peter, 2 at St. Paul's, which the Emperor Constantine had presented, each weighing 100 pounds. From these he replaced all the consecrated vessels. Opportunities were therefore available for imperial benefactions, but as far as we know, they didn't occur. Now, we might think this absence of information reflects our patchy sources for this period, or alternatively that most emperors from 455 to 476 experienced such short reigns that they hardly had a chance to undertake such projects. During this 21-year period, after all, no less than 9 emperors rose and fell. Not all were recognised throughout the regions they claimed to rule, and there are, I think, questions of the degree to which they will have had control of the resources supposedly at the command of an emperor, which would have enabled them to undertake substantial building or even make gifts to churches or other public amenities. Or perhaps the burdensome cost of military expeditions, particularly campaigns against the Vandals, of which there were several during this period, meant simply that no funds were available for non-essential activities. But having already examined the benefactions after 455 of the generals Ricimer and Valila, I do wonder why it is that generals had the resources to make such gifts, while emperors apparently did not. Now, in order to put these church benefactions by generals and the Roman residencies of 5th century emperors into their political context, I want to step back a moment to consider the backdrop against which they took place for those of you not familiar with this period. For not only were 5th century emperors spending far more time in Rome than their 4th century predecessors, as I've already mentioned, but in addition, a major transformation was taking place in the nature and perception of the imperial office across this period. And I believe this transformation was also a vital component in the balance of power between generals and emperors and their respective activities. I've argued elsewhere for the development of the child emperor phenomenon in the late Roman Empire, but for the purposes of this paper, the briefest explanation of my conclusions will have to suffice. From 367 to 455, the Western Roman Empire witnessed an astonishing and completely unprecedented succession of 4 child emperors to the throne. The youngest was 4 years of age, the oldest 10, with inevitable and serious consequences for both the functions and expectations of the imperial office itself. These child emperor accessions took place for various and complex reasons: matters of political opportunism, dynasticism, and avoidance of civil war. And it is not merely the tender ages of these emperors upon accession which is extraordinary, since young emperors had occurred before, but the repetition of these minority regimes, following on one after the other, their survival and their sheer length, which should give pause for thought. This is what makes for long-term change in the nature of a government. And though a child emperor, given time, will become an adult emperor, assuming he survives, I would argue that a gradual infantilization of the imperial office itself took place across this period, with long-term delegation of functions during an emperor's childhood, eventually contracting the range of functions available to an emperor overall, and in the end making the transition from a child ruler to an adult ruler in effect as well as in age extremely difficult. One of the many significant repercussions that this transformation had was this refocus on the city of Rome as a key political stage in this era of repeated minority regimes. For these child emperors needed this urban and civilian arena for spectacular ceremonial display far more than the military regimes of the 4th century emperors. And one of the most conspicuous ways in which imperial presentation was adapted across this period to make the rule of child emperors plausible was through emphasizing the ceremonial and religious functions of these emperors as foremost, with special attention to the particular piety, purity, and divine blessing which could be attributed to a child in such a role, at the same time as his military function was delegated on a long-term basis to a single dominant general. The sources for the period provide a wealth of evidence in support of this novel imperial presentation for all of these Western boy emperors, but I'll highlight just one example relating particularly to Honorius. The diptych of Probus, issued in 406, provides a wonderful visual depiction of this emphasis on the piety and divine blessing of an emperor as his most exceptional virtue. It displays Honorius, who was then aged 21, dressed in military attire, though he had never yet been near a battlefield, and beside him a banner topped with a Chi-Rho and declaring, "May you always conquer in the name of Christ." The young emperor's piety was being credited with his army's successes even without his presence on the battlefield, and even when he was in fact old enough to take up such a role. And in the context of the imperial return to Rome in the 5th century, this depiction is highly significant in illustrating that the marked emphasis on the Christian piety of young emperors like Honorius was something which continued throughout the reigns of these emperors who came to the throne as children, and only grew in importance over time as a justification for the emperor's position as others continued to lead the imperial armies. The Christian and ceremonial imperial functions were becoming paramount, and as part of this development, both imperial investment in churches at Rome and good relations with the aristocracy and the Bishop of Rome grew in importance in the 5th century. I mentioned earlier a conspicuous case of such cooperation between the imperial family and Bishop of Rome, which can actually still be seen today at San Paolo fuori le Mura, where a reconstructed mosaic inscription commemorates the joint efforts of the Empress Galla Placidia and Pope Leo I in the 440s. And I hope you can see the names of Placidia and Leo there. Yet while the presentation and role of emperors was changing in the 5th century, so too was the presentation and role of their dominant generals. We begin to find generals presented as the emperor's equal partner and direct representative in military affairs in ways not seen in earlier eras where the emperor had led the armies himself, as in the case of Stilicho, the magister militum of the emperor Honorius, whose exploits in war and achieving peace are described by the poet Claudian early in the 5th century in the following terms. Before our general Stilicho, Germany swears allegiance to the absent Honorius and addresses her suppliant prayers to him. Stilicho listens to their various prayers, gives tardy assent to their entreaties, and of his great bounty bestows upon them peace. That which others were enabled to win by long wars, this Honorius, Stilicho's mere march, gives to you. The case of the general Ricimer, referred to in a novel issued by the Emperor Majorian in 458, offers a similar picture of partnership, where the emperor declares that military matters will be the watchful concern of both ourselves and our parent and patrician Ricimer. The increasing prominence of generals in civilian public life is highlighted also by the fact that generals themselves now apparently kept their own panegyrists in their trains to sing their praises, a development known only from the 4th century onwards. Thanks to the writings of Sidonius Apollinaris, we know that the 5th century generals Stilicho, Aetius, Boniface, and Sebastianus all had their own panegyrists, a distinction we would not expect of any other office holder below the rank of emperor. And it is also significant that in this same era, while statues of distinguished senators continued to be erected in the Forum of Trajan, for the first time statues of generals began to appear in the Forum Romanum, where previously only statues of emperors had stood. This is a topic recently explored by Robert Chenot, highlighting that the Forum of Trajan remained the preserve of civilian office holders and literary men, with not a single dedication to military men appearing there during this period. In the Forum Romanum, however, multiple statue bases to 5th century military men are known. The general Stilicho alone may have had up to 4 bases in the Roman Forum, including this large equestrian statue base, reused equestrian statue base, which you may recognize, which stands still today opposite the Curia, dedicated to the fides et virtus of the Roman soldiers, and on which may have stood a statue of Stilicho, and which certainly shows the erasure of his name following his execution in 408. A gilded statue of Stilicho is known to have stood actually on the western rostra of the Forum Romanum, a remarkably prominent position for a man who was not the emperor. And the base, which records the statue's original location, is now in the gardens of the Villa Medici. It's this one here. This inscription declares that the Roman people, on account of his unique love and providence in its regard, have decreed that a statue of bronze and silver be placed on the rostra as a memory of Stilicho's everlasting glory. Similarly, statue bases to the generals Flavius, Constantius, and Aetius are known from this area, and given the sharp decrease in statue dedications even to emperors, generally from the 5th century onwards, the existence of such bases is all the more remarkable. With this sense of the expansion of the profile of magistri militum and their creeping upon imperial areas of activity in mind, is it possible that church benefaction was another area in which generals were beginning to encroach on what had previously been largely imperial territory at Rome? It is worth being aware that from around the late 4th century onwards we find similar instances of Eastern generals involving themselves in major church benefactions at Constantinople. The two magistri militum, Saturninus and Victor, for example, both apparently built monasteries for the monk Isaac on their estates in the 390s, competing for the monk's blessing. Moreover, although the benefactions made to Western churches that I've discussed were the gifts of generals holding Western commands, certainly one, and possibly two, of these generals had Eastern origins. Stilicho, though the most prominent years of his career would be spent in the West, had served his entire career in the East Roman army prior to 395. And there are reasons for believing that Felix, whose gift to the Lateran in the 420s marked the first benefaction to a church in Rome by a general, may also have come west in 425, following a previous Eastern career. It may be, therefore, that the idea of military men making conspicuous gifts to churches was one which Eastern office holders brought with them to the West in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. The case of the powerful Eastern general Flavius Ardaburius Aspar and his family are perhaps most interesting in terms of comparisons with the benefaction of Ricimer at St. Agata dei Goti. Aspar and his family were of Alan and Gothic heritage and were also Arians. We know that the family was responsible for gifts of ecclesiastical vessels at Antioch, one of which still survives today. But still more significant is the involvement of Aspar's family in the solidly Orthodox Nicene Church of St. Anastasia at Constantinople during the 460s, to which the family possibly donated funds for refurbishment and certainly gave liturgical vessels, according to the 5th century Vita of Marcianus. While remarkably the gratitude of the clergy for this donation was marked by the reading of scriptures in Gothic, although presumably Nicene scriptures, in the church on certain feast days. The choice of Aspar and his family in making gifts to a Nicene church, despite their own non-Nicene faith, is worth bearing in mind in relation to the benefaction of Ricimer at Rome. In their bids to dispense patronage and win support from senatorial elites and clergy, Arian generals were clearly willing to bestow largesse upon ecclesiastical establishments which did not share their own brand of Christianity. It may be significant that Ricimer did not choose this path. It is worth bearing in mind that when Theodoric, the Arian Ostrogothic king, known for his generally respectful and peaceful relations with the Roman aristocracy and clergy, visited Rome in 500, he famously paid marked attentions to St. Peter's Basilica. According to the anonymous Valesianus, Theodoric met with St. Peter with as much reverence as if he himself were a Catholic. I've already mentioned that the cases of the earlier benefactions of Stilicho and Felix could arguably be seen as supporting or complementing similar imperial activities, as well as their own positions in their respective imperial regimes. The particular churches to which Stilicho and Felix made gifts, the Basilica Apostolorum at Milan and the Lateran Basilica in Rome, also had established traditions of imperial involvement, further suggesting that the benefactions of these generals should be seen as complementary to imperial activity. Scholars considering the church benefactions of Ricimer and Valila in contrast have speculated as to whether the two generals were trying to win favour with the senatorial elite of Rome, or indeed competing with each other. But in the case of the benefaction of Ricimer particularly, I do feel there's a further question of whether his activity might be seen as competing with, rather than supporting, the imperial government's activities. Although Ricimer is often seen as continuing on the role of powerful generalissimos such as Stilicho and Aetius in the Western imperial government and acting as a power behind the throne, there is a fundamental difference in that while both Stilicho and Aetius served one emperor, and as far as we can tell, entirely loyally throughout long careers, Ricimer was directly involved in the accessions and depositions, or indeed deaths, of no less than 5 emperors, from the time of his emergence as a power player in 456 until his own death in 472. It is hardly overstating the case to say that Ricimer's relations with emperors were deeply unstable. Although church benefaction was a traditional elite activity, since Ricimer's benefaction was probably Arian rather than Nicene, it was therefore unlikely to win him friends among the senators or clergy of Rome, but very likely to consolidate his support among the largely Gothic and Arian contingents of his armies. Was Ricimer's gift to St. Agata de' Gotti, therefore, a bid both to secure further his following in the Western military, and also in a wider sense to display his ability to dispense such patronage and largesse in an era when emperors apparently could not? The emperor with whom Ricimer's relationship is most extensively attested is the emperor Anthemius. Anthemius was in fact an Eastern general with imperial connections sent to the West in 467 as emperor following negotiations between Western and Eastern governments, and with the agreement of Ricimer. To win over Ricimer's loyalty to the new emperor, Anthemius' young daughter Alypia was wed to the general. Sidonius Apollinaris tells of how, journeying to Rome in late 467, I arrived here at the moment of the marriage of Ricimer the patrician, whose union with the daughter of the immortal Augustus is a hopeful guarantee of the safety of the state. But the marriage did not, unfortunately, secure peace, and in 470 Ricimer rebelled against Anthemius, leading Sidonius to declare to his brother-in-law, the general Ecdicius, that if the state has neither strength nor soldiers, if, as report has it, the emperor Anthemius has no resources, then our nobility has resolved under your guidance to give up either its country or its hair. As many of you would be aware, since Sidonius soon afterwards became Bishop of Clermont and would have been tonsured as part of taking up his office, he did in fact quite literally lose his hair. But finally, in 472, Ricimer besieged Anthemius at Rome for 5 months, and having starved the city into submission, sacked it, proclaimed a new emperor, Olybrius, and murdered Anthemius. This sack of Rome in 472 in the civil war between Ricimer and Anthemius is an important reminder that the return of the imperial court to the city also heightened its status as both a physical and ideological battleground between emperors and their generals. Returning to the last of these generals' benefactions, Valila's benefaction of St. Andrea Catabarbara may only have been carried out upon his death, and therefore may be a less political initiative, although, as Umberto Roberto has pointed out, given his possession of the wealthy estate of Junius Bassus and his prominently marked senatorial seat in the Colosseum, it is unlikely Valila was without political ambitions. Furthermore, in preserving the spectacular marble panels of his predecessor as patron of the building, and simply adding his own inscription and decorations, Valila arguably in some ways connected himself to the prestige of its earlier Roman aristocratic owner. It has also been suggested that Valila's church benefactions were motivated in part by the fact that during the 460s and 470s, making civic benefactions at Rome was probably impossible due to political chaos, and therefore Valila turned to the church. But instances of civic patronage do exist in this era, such as the restorations which took place in the Colosseum in the 470s, suggesting this is not the case. In choosing to conserve and rededicate an existing basilica, Valila was also in line with concerns expressed in legislation by recent emperors about the repairing of existing ancient buildings, in particular the Emperor Majorian, who in 458 issued a novel insisting that those things which belong to the splendour of the cities ought to be preserved by civic affection even under the necessity of repair. But in addition, church benefactions had come to be seen as extremely potent gifts. Over the first half of the 5th century, they were perhaps the most common gifts made by emperors to the city of Rome. And I suspect that generals were now seeking for themselves the sort of divine blessing such gifts were seen to bestow upon the donor, as well as the favour of their peers. It is surely significant that these benefactions took place at Rome, where the court was now resident, even though none of these generals is known to have originated in the city or even from Italy, and their military duties must have involved lengthy absences from court on campaign. Yet, as I mentioned when talking at the beginning about Stilicho's benefaction at Milan, these activities tended to follow the emperor's court. What is also important to note about Valila's benefaction, in contrast to that of Ricimer's, is the clear involvement of the Bishop of Rome of the time, Simplicius, directly mentioned in the inscription recording the transformation of the basilica. This indication of papal support would also play a role in the ideological value of the gift to the donor and his followers. The involvement of military men in ecclesiastical politics generally was not unusual in the 5th century, regardless of their own particular brand of Christianity. When legislating on ecclesiastical matters, emperors might call upon generals to provide the military might to enforce their decisions, as was the case in 445, when the Emperor Valentinian III instructed the Magister Militum Aetius to carry out disciplinary measures against Hilary, the disobedient Bishop of Arles. Military men might also become more independently involved in church issues. According to the 5th century historian Prosper Tiro, the general Felix in 427 apparently ordered the assassination of a Gallic bishop. And indeed Felix himself would meet his end in 430 on the steps of a Ravenna basilica, killed along with his wife and a deacon by mutinying soldiers. And a further indication of the public awareness of the immense influence wielded by military men are the surviving letters written to them by churchmen seeking their intervention in ecclesiastical affairs, such as those addressed by Pope Leo I and Theodoret of Cyrus to the Eastern General Aspar. But the involvement of generals in church politics at the request of emperors or churchmen was one thing. The considerable expense of major benefaction to a church on the scale of Ricimer or Valila was another sort of public statement altogether, and the political motivations of such activities should be carefully considered. The 5th century was a tumultuous period for the Western Roman Empire generally, and for the city of Rome specifically. The changing nature of the emperor's role and the increasing emphasis on his Christian and ceremonial functions, with the long-term delegation of his military leadership to powerful generals, fundamentally altered the balance of power between emperor and military. In addition, the return of the imperial court to primary residence in Rome made the city itself once more a key stage for physical and ideological struggles for power and influence. The political prominence of the three generals who are recorded as making major benefactions to churches in Rome in the 5th century, Felix, Ricimer and Valila, and their following on from the example of the immensely powerful Magister Militum Stilicho and his benefaction at Milan, suggest that more than simple piety might be involved. Given the low numbers of securely attested aristocratic interventions in churches in Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, the fact that a quarter of those known were the gifts of generals suggests that they should be considered in their own right for what they may reveal about the dynamics of power relations between elites at Rome in the 5th century. When set against the backdrop of an increase in imperial benefactions over the first half of the 5th century, followed by the complete disappearance of such discernible imperial gifts after 455, the efforts of high-profile generals such as Ricimer and Valila take on potentially even greater significance. Moreover, considering the dynamics of relations between emperors, generals, aristocrats and clergy is an important reminder that, significant as the Bishop of Rome was, he did not yet in the 5th century dominate competition for influence in the city. To conclude, Gregory of Tours recounts a story about the Magister Militum Aetius, of how while he was preparing for war against Attila the Hun in Gaul in 451, his wife, fearful for her husband's safety, would daily frequent the churches of Rome praying for his safe return. One night, a drunken beggar who had mistakenly been locked into St. Peter's Basilica overheard two saints discussing the situation. The older of the two apparently said to his companion, "I cannot bear any longer the tears of the wife of Aetius. She keeps on praying that I should bring her husband back safe from Gaul. God in his wisdom has decreed otherwise, but nevertheless I have obtained this immense concession that Aetius shall not be killed. And I order the man who has overheard this to keep his counsel and not be so rash as to reveal my secret." The poor man, of course, did not keep the secret, and was immediately struck blind upon uttering his news of the general's salvation to the first person he met the following morning, in what seems a most unsaintly act of retribution by the apostles upon whom he had eavesdropped. Slowly but surely, the dominant generals of the Western Roman Empire were making their presence felt in the churches of Rome. Amidst the rather short list of securely attested aristocratic benefactions in the 4th and 5th centuries, the proportion of those interventions actually undertaken by generals is deserving of further attention and should be separated out from their senatorial but non-military peers. Ecclesiastical gifts by the highest-ranking officers of the Roman military were a new development in both East and West in the 5th century. And although the sparse nature of our evidence does mean that we can only speculate as to the implications of these benefactions, it is clear that such ecclesiastical gifts on the part of generals might have wider political ramifications than those of the civilian senatorial elite at Rome. Perhaps military expansion into this area is unsurprising, given that generals had long been called upon by emperors and churchmen to assist in settling ecclesiastical disputes. But I suspect that the emergence of the Magister Militum as a church benefactor is a significant development in the relationship between an increasingly Christianized and civilianized imperial office in this era, an increasingly powerful military, and the emerging power of church leaders. Thank you.